Hi guys, my name is Manuel, and in this video I'm gonna show you a very simple way to master the basic camera settings on any camera out there. So if you're new to photography or you just got a new camera and you're trying to get your head around the basic settings, then this video is for you. So let's jump right into it. There are three settings that all influence the exposure of your image, and because they influence each other, we put them in this nice triangle. It's also called the exposure triangle. And yeah, let's start with the first one, the aperture. The aperture is basically the eye of the lens, and it determines of how much light comes into the lens, into your camera on the sensor. So the lower the f number, the more light comes in. The higher the f number, less light comes in. And the f-stop also determines of how cinematic your shots might look. If you have a good lens with an aperture of a 1.4, your background can get very blurry, and yeah, you only have a very shallow depth of field, which, if you want to achieve that, can be a very nice look. But when you're shooting architecture, for example, and you want your foreground to the background, everything sharp, you just close the aperture, which means a higher f-stop, let's say a 16 or 22, and then you get everything sharp. But when you're closing the aperture, so a higher f-stop, which means the exposure gets also much darker. So that means we need to change either our ISO or the shutter speed. Let's jump on to the next one, the shutter speed. The shutter speed is basically the motion controller. It has an effect on how long light comes into your camera on the sensor. So if you want to freeze an image that is fast moving, let's say a sport shot like a running person, you need to close down the shutter speed to, let's say, 1,000th of a second, or even shorter to freeze the image. But if you may be shooting architecture and you want a person walking by just being totally unsharp and blurry, you might like the effect of opening up your shutter speed to about 1/10th of a second or 1/5th of a second, for example. Then everything which is not moving on your image will be sharp. If you have your camera on a tripod, if you're not using a tripod, probably all your images that have a longer exposure than 1/60 of a second will be slightly blurry, depending on how good your hands are, of course. So if you're closing the aperture to, let's say, a 16 or 22, we need to open up our shutter speed. But if we're getting into a range where things are getting blurry and we don't want that, we only have one setting that can help us out here, and that is the ISO. It's a kind of light booster. It determines of how sensitive your sensor is to light. So most sensors have a natural sensitivity of about 100, which means with 100 ISO, your image looks very nice and has the best quality. But it also means it needs more light. So if you're going up one full step, need only half the light. And now comes the twist. How do these settings all influence each other? I'm gonna tell you how. These settings influence each other direct proportional. So if you have set up your camera setting to third stops, which any camera should be set up. If you have not third stops, then please change that on your camera setting. which means if I'm shooting with a 1.4 and an ISO of 400 and a 120, and I need to close my aperture of one full stop, which means I need one full stop in shutter speed to have the same exposure of image. So I would need to jump to a 1/60 of a second, or I change my ISO to 800. Yeah? So, and the best thing for you guys to truly understand these basic settings is to play around with them. I really can recommend to play around with the aperture and shoot the same image several ways. In once with the open aperture, then you have to determine what part of the image you want sharp and which one should be unsharp, and then you shoot an image with a very closed aperture, let's say a 16 or 22, where everything is sharp. Then you need to rise the ISO and make the shutter speed longer. It's very fun to play around and see what effect it has. Like for me, that was really a eye-opener when I learned that. I was like, hey, why does nobody explain that to me in that simple way? So there are the f-stops, there's the shutter speed, there's the ISO, they're all direct proportional. If you change one setting or one full stop, you will need to change the other two also by one stop to have the same exposure of image. That's how easy it is. So if that helped you out and you learned something, leave me a like and follow me for more valuable information on camera stuff, creativity, and more. So see you around. Bye bye.